Well, excuse me, it's 11 o'clock, it's 11:01. So it's time to get started. Any questions before we begin? So I have today, we're going to take a look at the rest of Romanesque, and we're going to look at the Gothic in Northern Europe. And the overarching theme here is we're going to look at the evolution, the development of what becomes the Gothic cathedral, and connected to that is the evolution of sculpture in Europe, because as the Gothic cathedrals are built, they become increasingly adorned with sculpture. That's really one of the primary means of iconography in this period. And we'll take a look at manuscript illumination. And so before we do anything, I have something of utmost importance. November, no sun, no moon, no morn, no noon, no dawn, no dusk, no proper time of day, no warmth, no cheerfulness, no healthful ease, no comfortable field in any member, no shade, no shine, no butterflies, no bees, no fruits, no flowers, no leaves, no birds, November. Just a pretty cheery little poem. Okay, good. Colin, I need you to send me an email just as Xander did, and I got one from Avery too. Anybody on Zoom, just send me that email as a reminder, if you will. And so, let's take a look at this. Slideshow from the beginning. And so where we left off was right here. And we were talking about how these cathedrals in Northern Europe started to take on a floor plan that would resemble a cross. And so that won't stay the same in the next few centuries, but it will stay the same. It'll influence a lot of things that'll happen in Italy at the time. The idea of having the whole building itself resemble a crucifix. And so anyway, I'll put this up. Saint Foy, we know Saint Faith. We saw the reliquary. This is mid-11th to early 12th century. So it's basically in the 1000s or early 1100s. And so we can see it's basically starting to develop. You can see the cross shape here. You can follow this roof line and that roof line. And so that is one of the early Gothic cathedrals. Another thing to point out too is that it's not really adorned on the exterior. we've seen a lot of buildings, a lot of prayer buildings, mosques especially, where the tiles, the mosaic, and just elaborate on the surface. And not so, but that'll change. And here is a cathedral from Spain. And again, we see it's got arches, but I don't know how you feel about this, but when we've seen things like Hagia Sophia, and we saw the great mosque cathedral in Cordoba, and you see these walls, and these walls, they don't really have any frescoes. They don't have a lot of things. It's basically brickwork and cut stone, masonry. Now, the apse will be decorated somewhat, but not like we saw. And this was the thing. And I want to point out, movable pews. Is this the same one? This is St. James, St. Cyran, another folding chairs. Same aesthetic. No ornamentation, high ceilings. That's what they strove for. That's kind of the big thing. We see it's starting to happen here. It's happening here, 11th century, 11th, early 12th century. High ceilings. And this is a restored cutaway. And if you would follow this out, I just want to say, because you can't really see this on the cutaway, but that roof line here goes this way. The roof line here, it would end right there. So this would still be in the shape of a crucifix. And so you can see how they've done this to get higher. They kind of go narrower as it goes up. And so on the inside, you see the columns, but you see the walls pushed out on the sides. And what this does is that it distributes the weight differently. Some of the weight being pulled and supported by the columns all through it, and then the outward spread distribution of the weight. And so these parts of the cathedral almost act like flying buttresses in a way. They buttress the roof line. And so what we get here is we start to see, and you can see this is the beginning, almost the beginning of the 12th century. After a while, the cathedrals begin to be adorned. The early ones, not so much. We don't see frescoes, we don't see sculpture, we just see basic stone, bricks, marble, unadorned. And so here's Christ in majesty. And we already knew this, didn't we? Because we studied the iconography. He doesn't have the beard, to be sure. And though he's got the Bible, he's given the sign of peace, and his halo has the cross. Does anybody know what these represent? Just asking. So we got an angel, we got the bird, which is probably the Holy Spirit. These two figures, I'm not really sure about, but they must be saintly because they too have halos. And it could be symbols for the writers of the Gospels. And I don't really have them right off the top of my head, pardon me. But I know that St. John is the eagle, I believe, and St. Matthew's St. John's the lion, St. Matthew the eagle. Anyway, there's a lot of iconography that is ascribed to the saints, and that develops here too. So here we go, another Christ in Majesty, and it's from the doorway of the Abbey Church, Saint Genis de Fontaine, France, early 11th century. And take a look at this stylistically. This looks like it could be from antiquity, much earlier than this. And we see this is Christ. He's got the beard, got the halo, the good book. Bless him. And so, and he's enthroned. And he's bigger. So what we get is the same thing that we started to see emerge in Byzantine culture before the fall of Rome. And that is they bring back this idea of theological sizes, that the most important people are bigger. We've seen that before too. We've seen that in antiquity, and that's pretty much what they're looking to. And so Christ in his majesty. And it's lintel over doorway. I remember that term, lintel. Those little beans you get put in soup. Lintel, post and lintel, that kind of architecture starts to come back too, especially in the doorways. They have a lintel, and they'll particularly have 3 posts holding them up, one in the center and one on either sides, and the doors are typically double doors. But at any rate, we go back to something that's still more symbolic. And I want to kind of point this out too. This is hard to see. Maybe we can zoom in on this. I want to point this out right there and right there. The wounds of Christ post crucifixion. And so this is really kind of an interesting relief. And this is how the ornamentation starts to come back into the cathedrals by the 12th century. And what we get are these relief sculptures. And so check this out. This is, you can count these up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The 12 apostles. And this one, you guys remember, any of you familiar with the story of the apostle St. Thomas? Well, these 11 apostles had witnessed the resurrection of Christ. They weren't there at the resurrection, but he came. He visited them, and they were in disbelief. One of the apostles was not there. That was Thomas. When Thomas was told of the resurrection, he scoffed. I don't believe it. And I won't believe it until I put my fingers in the wounds inflicted on Christ. And so that's what he's doing there. There is some iconography issues about which side Christ was speared by the Roman soldier, but in this case, it's the right side. Anyway, that's what he's doing. He's sticking his finger in the wound. And so that's part of the Christian belief. And so, I'm gonna run this. This is more of that kind of decoration, historiated capital. And so kind of what that means is that instead of using a pattern or design that we saw develop in the Greco-Roman times with Ionic, Doric, Corinthian, start design their own capitals. And oftentimes they have something to do with telling a story, a history, if you will. And so here it is, we're in the 12th century, the cloister of St. Pierre, Mosaic, France. Cloister. This is one of those places. This is a monastery. This is a place where the monks live. And they set themselves apart from the rest of the world. And so a lot of times these places actually become pretty elaborate. Mind you, the political and economic system at play here. What we have are emperors, the Holy Roman Emperor, if you will, on top of the pyramid, just below the Pope, who is actually the highest authority. And then under that, we have royalty at various ranks, barons, lords, ladies, marquises, etc., viceroys. Anyway, bottom line, as I was telling you the other day, those royal families were expected to support the church, even to the point where they would raise at least one of their male children to be in the priesthood at some level, the clergy, and a female child to be a nun, join an order, if you will. So that's kind of, with all of that emphasis on that, there was should be no surprise that along with raising money and raising children to support these monasteries, it would also build very nice places, the chapels, the cloister area, etc. So anyway, more and more elaborate. Habit Duran, this again, it's got a halo too. So. And he's given the sign of peace. He's a disciple of Christ, but he is not Christ. And partly we can tell that by the fact he's wearing the clothes of a clergyman, including the cap. And secondly, there's no cross. But this is, what's he got in his hand here? I'm trying to figure this out. You ever heard of a shepherd's crook? It's what shepherds carry. It's like a huge cane. It's, as you can see here, it's very long. And it's something that shepherds carry. They have, shepherds have a lot of things that they do. If you're a shepherd, you got to be pretty skilled at a lot of things. And it's always good to have a herding breed of a dog or two to shepherd those sheep, to keep the flock together, because chances are left unattended, they'll spread out and they'll get lost and everything. And that's part of the Bible. And Jesus talked about retrieving the lost sheep. And in the Bible, Christ is referred to as the great shepherd. Well, what does that have to do with this? Christ as a great shepherd, and those in authority in the church are also, they consider themselves to be shepherds. And so they have this shepherd's crook. Now, how is this used in sheep herding? Well, you know, oftentimes you got to walk a long ways and you use it like a cane when necessary. But mostly what you use is to prod those sheep from letting the flock get too large. Poke at them with it and go back into the herd. And so, yeah, and the dogs I was talking about, what we still have German shepherds. They were developed as a herding dog. There's a lot of different kinds. And so anyway, it's all tied into the Christian belief of the Good Shepherd. Here's something I got to show you too. Interior of the Abbey of the Church of Notre Dame. When you see Notre Dame, or in French Notre Dame, you got to look at where it's at, because there are many places in France that will be titled Notre Dame, which means the Virgin Mary. It's not, that's not the translation, but that's who that is. This is Notre, which is the sort of the Latin romantic root word of like notorious or famous or notoriety and so on. Extremely well known and important. Dame, woman. And so anyway, but here, you know, we're in the 12th century and we're still, the interiors not particularly well adorned. But South Portal, St. Pierre, this is a tympanum right here. It's the part over the doorway, the semicircle, the archway. And this becomes a staple, a convention of Gothic architecture. I told you a moment ago we had post and lintel. This is the lintel, and there are the posts, either side. But we start to see relief as ornamentation. And if I might be so bold, I would say that they're taking a page out of Islamic architecture. Of course, these are all more based on figures and icons and stuff, but this elaborate decoration and patterning and stuff, we've seen that. And so again, I talked a moment ago about the theological size, Christ being preeminent, predominant. We see here angels with the wings, and we see down here a whole host of people looking up to Christ. And it appears as though these are Christ's servants based on what they have in their hands. So yeah, check this out. That floral motif, again, we've seen this. And so here we go. Tympanum, Trumeau, jambs. These, we still use that door jambs where the doors are hooked up to the wall. post and lintel with an archway. And this area, as I just showed you, that really becomes the first area to receive that kind of treatment. That'll change. It'll start to expand as I speak. West facade, Notre Dame, Le Grand, Poitiers, France. What was this other one? Mosaic, France. So like I said, a lot of Notre Dames, everything, a lot of things are named after Notre Dame. 12th century. And again, well, this is really a sea change where almost the entire facade is covered with relief sculptures, as well as decoration, as well as ornamentation, as well as geometric and floral patterning. I gotta throw this word out there too. We talk about patterning, and geometric patterning is one, but there's another term for that floral patterning, and that would be called biomorphic patterns. The shape of something living, bio. And so anyway, check this out. This is actually quite stunning. And again, kind of a split between a lot of that exquisite ornamentation as well as figures, important figures, holy figures, and then highest and biggest up here, Christ. Again, look at how ornate. This is just at the portal, which is the entryway. You see the rest of the building, not quite so elaborate, basically brickwork, but again, we start somewhere. And that historiated capital, and historiated base, if you will. And so Old Testament prophet Jeremiah or Isaiah, kind of what we still don't know about a lot of these figures is obviously exactly who they are, but you can see the development, the integration of sculpture into the buildings. This is like a big feature of Romanesque art. And I want to kind of add this too, is that during this time, you okay? Yeah. During this time, I was talking about how the social structure was set up with a very rigid class structure, and so we had the Pope, the barons, or the emperors, barons, and so on. And I wanted to kind of mention the people on the lower strata. Now, the lowest strata would be people who were kind of shunned from the whole social system for whatever reason, be it that they had diseases or something. And back in those days, if you were sick, they basically put you away in an asylum of some sort. And they would, it was their own way of quarantining people with illnesses, partly because there were no vaccinations or anything. The main way that you kept a disease from spreading was to put them in a colony. And there were a lot of diseases that were devastating at this time, one of them being leprosy. That was a plague on humanity for many, many centuries. And they would create what we would call a leper colony. Or in France, they would call it a pest house. Pestilence, same root word. That's where they would keep people with diseases. But after that, in the rest of the functioning world, what they had were people that were what we would call peons or serfs. And they were basically the people that did all of the hard work, like planting, like harvesting, like all of the stuff that would make life possible. Bottom line, workers. And then there was another class that did the skilled work, and those would be masons, and in this era, sculptors, would be in that class of people. They weren't, artists weren't all that well noted. The architects were higher up because they had the skills, the mathematics skills, the engineering skills, the organizational skills. But these people that worked on these cathedrals, they just did their work. Even if you were a sculptor, in many cases, it wasn't like you would have your name on it. It would be like very well known, except for a few instances where we know who these people are. It was a trade. They were tradespeople, just like a stonemason, just like a blacksmith, just like a physician, and so on. And so anyway, I'm saying all of this because there was this idea in Europe at the time that why you were here as a human being was to serve God. That was your primary function. Didn't have all of these personal ambitions. You just kind of found your place and did your job. And so these people oftentimes worked tirelessly, and they worked sometimes their whole lives. This is we kind of figured it within 15 years. There are a lot of these places that it takes like in this case, well, that's only 15 years. As we move forward, we'll see a lot of cases where these cathedrals take a lifetime to build. And there are a lot of people working on these that never see the end result of their labor. And so anyway, it was very stratified and so on. Here is one of those sculptors that kind of breaks out and has some recognition. Veritas. And this is Christ, the Last Judgment. See, it's Christ. Doesn't have book, not giving the blessing, but he is here to decide who comes into heaven and who is cast into hell. And again, this is something that we've seen kind of emerge into the Christian conventional artwork, and that is that we find words. We find quotations from the Bible, from the Gospels, according to Jesus. We have here our angels again, winged figures holding up everything, and Christ enthroned. Again, Pentecost. and the mission of the apostles. And this is basically where the Holy Spirit descends on the apostles as they're gathered. They begin talking in tongues. It's in the Bible. It's why we have Pentecostal religion based on this event in the life of Christ. But again, here we go. Largest figure by far. The iconography starting to change still. We still have the beard. We still have the cross in the halo, but it becomes much more elaborate. This Croix de Chevalier, looking north. This is in Syria. And what this is a fortress. As I was saying earlier, we had a number of crusades where the Pope and the Emperor and the kings and so on, they got together and they were going to reclaim the Middle East for Christianity. And oftentimes they stayed. They stayed for a long time. In this case, look at how long it took to build this. 28 years. So it wasn't a temporary thing. In some cases, they actually built fortresses and had outposts that they maintained in the Middle East. Here's Giselbertus again. The suicide of Jesus. Well, this is it's actually kind of different, and it's kind of gruesome. And Judas was the guy who betrayed Jesus and had second thoughts after they saw what they were doing to Christ and trying to give money back, and I recant my testimony and all of this other stuff. No dice, so he killed himself. And so what you see here, demon angels, and we see Judas as he hung himself, just as I say, pretty gruesome. But they were there to tell a story. And so you see it every once in a while, references to the Old Testament, but most of what you'll see is related to the New Testament. Eve, Old Testament, modesty, root of knowledge, there she is, she's picking it. And again, manuscript illumination flourishes. Saint Mark. And again, they kind of likened themselves in the monasteries to the gospel writers because they were following the same tradition, writing the story and preserving the story of Christ. And so late 11th century, so this is almost 1100, starting to see ornamentation. These are not so austere, they're not so stark, they're not so plain. Christ in majesty. Looks like something that may have been like out of San Vitale or something. It looks very Byzantine, but that's what they went on. But you see, the art forms, they're surviving and they're growing. Virgin and child, kind of a different look. And again, this Christ, I was saying earlier, you'll find many depictions, some of which are Christ as a small adult, and that's certainly the case here. And the arms are broken off. But you can imagine that he has the sign of peace and the book with him. Spire Cathedral, you start to see these emerge in the architecture, and here's it. And again, we're in the 12th century here, and adornment, we're seeing that. Again, they're paying attention, using the space to tell the stories of Christianity. And this is more manuscript illumination, and we're still following the same conventions: Christ highest or higher and larger. Baptism of Christ, St. John the Baptist, Christ, and a baptismal font. We've seen some of that already, but they're actually starting to make their own. Centuries before this, they would, for a nice baptismal font, they would have to go to the Middle East. They had to go to the Islamic world, where you had the artists that knew about metallurgy and engraving and bronze casting and so on. They're finding it out. They're getting it back. They're developing. Reliquary. We talked about those. Adorned with images this time, not like the reliquary of St. Faith. It's got the jewels to be sure, but start to see. And in here, this is Alexander. So, St. Stephen, Theodolus. And so anyway, they got this in here. This is a cathedral complex, Pisa. And in Italy, they take an entirely different track. I want to point that out. And they're making things much differently. We'll take a look at Italy in chapter 14, but bottom line is that their traditions and their architecture develops in an entirely different way. And this is baptistry in Florence. One of the ways that it develops in Italy is that they're a little closer to Greece and Rome, and they come upon a lot of this classical notion that mathematics is truth. And so they can start really concentrating on ratios and proportions and geometric shapes. To be sure, we still have Christ here, the symbol of Christ, and an angel on top, but kind of different. It's completed in the 13th century, so in the 1200s. And again, we start to see ornamentation, but this, instead of relief sculptures, look at that. That's geometry. And I might add, they were closer to the ancient texts from Greece and Rome. They were also a lot closer to the Islamic world, where mathematics was flourishing. And so creation and temptation of Adam and Eve. There's the temptation of fruit. Sculpture starts it out. Anyway, this is one thing that we'll develop here out of the Romanesque, and these are the spires, these towers, and it kind of follows the same ideas religious philosophy that you find in the Islamic world. We see minarets that reach up into the heavens, and we see these cathedrals start to adopt some of those same conventions. And here, this is the quadrant arch here. This is, in fact, a buttress. This is in England, almost the 12th century, late 11th. And of course, it looks like a crucifix. English manuscript. And again, like I say, they try to establish themselves as the descendants of writers of the gospel. I wanted to say this one thing, that the Baal tapestry, the Battle of Hastings, and this is the Norman invasion of England, and basically changes England forever. And this battle was in 1066. This is soon afterwards. And what they do is they start to make tapestries, not quite as elaborate as what we see coming from Persia, Persian rugs, but they also have a different function, and that is they commemorate history. And so a lot of what we know about this period has everything to do with their tapestries. And so let's take a look. Make sure I got the right share for folks at home. Good. Okay, so we're going to kind of split this in Europe. We're going to look at the north, we're going to look at Italy, because they really develop into two different cultures at this point. Partly it's a function of the fact that they have developed. They're out of the Dark Ages. They have fully functioning government. They have organization. They have armies that can defend their territory and their population. And so this is what this looks like. Holy Roman Empire. This is, like I said, Germany, the papal states around Rome, two Sicily's here. Still kind of going back and forth, but this is mostly Christian. This is mostly Muslim. And again, we got England and the Normans, just say, bottom line, this is the politics and the cultures. And so one of the earliest, what we would consider to be Gothic cathedrals is this, Saint Denis, France. Mid-12th century. And you see it's not symmetrical. It's got one spire, one bell tower here. And there are a couple of things about it, but it has, well, let me show you this. And this is about the cathedral at Saint Denis. Come on. The internet's a little slow today.
of the Gothic.
Thanks to Sujet, who was the abbot in the first half of the 12th century, this church is incredibly important as the burial place of the royal family, since Sujet himself is also a advisor.
Standing.
Oh, I can't keep this going.
So the
Let me
choir,
pause it. I need to get this. I want to get this full screen.
here is the space of the altar of the church.
I guess we'll go with it.
Looking on at Basilica of San
The birthplace of the Gothic.
Thanks to Sujet, who was the abbot in the first half of the 12th century, this church is incredibly important because it's the burial place of the royal family, since Sujet himself is also an advisor to the royal family.
We're standing in a choir, and light is pouring in the room.
So the choir is the space behind the altar of the church, and the ambulatory is the aisle that would take one behind the altar.
Actually, it's taking us around behind the altar.
Now, Sujet completed the ambulatory and also the facade of the church.
And none of this was new construction. There had been a century church here, and Sujet felt that it was inadequate as the burial place of the kings. At this historical moment, the kings of France only really controlled the hill defense as the area immediately around Paris. But this was a time when the king's power was expanding, and Sujet really wanted to create an architectural style that would express the growing power of the monarch.
See, that's what I'm talking about. A lot about the social structures, the kings, and the Pope, and all of this politics. It really plays into it. Is the contributing factor. It is the setting in which a lot of these things develop. We talk about historical context. In this is really very important, as it is usually.
Now, in the history of Western church architecture, the way that this would generally work is you would have an entrance around the back of the altar to stop at each of the small waiting chapels. That is, these small rooms that would contain relics.
In the past, during the MS period, these chapels would be literally separate rooms with walls around them. And Sujet's idea was instead to open up the space and to allow light to flood in. And that's exactly how this looks. And it must have looked so different than anything anyone had seen before.
Instead of this,
Okay, I want to show you this too. This, they were talking about the kings being buried here. This is where they're buried, actually. This is it's the sarcophagus all the way around.
looking like a set of walls that are pierced by windows and the romanesque relatively small windows. Instead, he's figured out how to engineer this structure in stone so that the walls can basically disappear and be replaced by glass, colored glass that lets this brilliant, luminous color into the space. So let's talk about two things: how he did this, and second of all, why he did this. So let's talk about how he did it. Look above us, there's this complex web of interlocking pointed vaulting.
Pointed arches are really key here because the one thing, you can cover spaces of different shapes and sizes. Perhaps most importantly, a pointed arch doesn't push so much out as it does down. And because of that, the architect didn't need to build thick walls.
A traditional Roman arch generally has to be placed on quite heavy walls because it really does push outward. It splays. What the pointed arch does is it tends to take the weight of the vaulting and push it more straight down so that the weight doesn't have to be buttressed from the side.
Looking up at those ribs, we have a sense of a pull toward the vertical. And all of these ribs and this vaulting rests on these thin columns. So there's a real sense of elegance and openness to this space.
And it's so radically different from the Romanesque that came before, which felt so solid and where your eye was always drawn around that rounded arch back down. And you felt the sense of gravity, you felt a sort of rootedness with the Romanesque. It was so different here. You have to remember the church itself, any consecration is an expression of the Holy Jerusalem. It is everywhere. So the idea is how can one transport us to a more heavenly place, to a more spiritual place. Abbot Sujet believed that light could do this.
Sujet thought he was reading the writing of Saint Denis, of the patron saint of this church.
Instead, he was reading a philosopher from the 6th century. But the important part is he took this notion of the divinity of light from that writing and made that practical within architectural setting.
Right, that writing that he thought was by Saint Denis talked about how light was connected to the divine. So what Sujet wanted was to open up those walls and allow in the light that would allow a type of thinking on the part of the visitors where they would move from the contemplation of the light to God.
This was a radical and new notion and actually flew in the face of other theological theories of the time. When you think about the ideas that are being established by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who's saying we have to get rid of all of the decorative, we have to get rid of everything that will distract us. So Jenny is moving in the other direction and saying, no, in fact, we can transport people.
That the visual is not a distraction, but a way of transporting us to the divine.
I have to say that I think Sujet was incredibly successful. This is startlingly new, and I feel transported.
So there was theology involved in this, the idea of light. And I was just pointing out in Romanesque, they didn't really adorn the walls with painting or sculpture or much of anything. And it was, as the quote was in this film, that it was better to just look at the marble than to be distracted by all of the images and all of the light coming in. And so this is Abbot Sujet, and he was a monk. He was the head monk. That's what an abbot is, the person in charge of the abbey. And the other thing is, and should not be surprising, is that when I talk about this social structure and where these people were, this guy was in the abbey, he was an abbot, and where did all of the knowledge and information and literature and culture reside? In the monasteries. It's still a carryover from the days when they had to hide away from the Viking invaders and other invaders too, to be sure. And so anyway, this is it, and I'm glad you got to see this, and that was a wonderful shot of what the inside of Saint Denis looks like. I want to tell you a story about Saint Denis himself, because you'll find these pictures all over, or this is a sculpture, by the way, but you'll see these pictures over and over again. Saint Denis. He's a guy who lost his head, to say. What up with this? Let me tell you. Saint Denis was the bishop of Paris back in the early Christian church, when France, Gaul, at the time was governed and run by the Romans, and at a time before Christianity was accepted, tolerated, legalized. And so Denis was an early martyr of the church. And the Romans beheaded him for whatever they call it, subversion, treason, whatever. It's against the law. Okay. his head off. So what Saint Denis did when they cut off his head was he bent over and picked his head up. And he started walking. And he walked like 20 miles or so. And then he came to rest under a tree and he died with his head in his hands, quite literally. And that's the spot where that first church was built. And they have the relics of Saint Denis, actually, after Christianity was, as it became more the official religion, and then after Romans left, and after the Middle Ages of the Viking invasions and the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, and by now they're assigning patron saints to countries. And Saint Denis was the patron saint of France until the 20th century. And so he was the official patron saint. And this cathedral was a monument to him and a monument to religion. And so, yeah, this is a painting, obviously. Let's go now. A couple of angels helping him out. It's got the stigmata too, which is kind of an interesting touch here. Stigmata is having the wounds of Christ on your hands and feet. So there he is. He's a bishop. And so that's Saint Denis. And we start to see all of these sculptures start to really, I mean, like they said in the video, everything becomes an opportunity, every space, an opportunity to illustrate the religion and the stories. And so here we go. It's a wonderful stained glass. They open this up. They explain the pointed archways and the multiple archways hooked together to kind of be able to create the space. Again, Sujet, an architect himself, he could figure out how to do this. He was not only in the high ranks of the clergy, he was also a learned person that could actually do this. And he was enough of a theologian that he read philosophy and religion and the writings of these people. And as it said in the video, he thought he was reading the original words of Saint Denis, but it was a 6th century philosopher. But nevertheless, he was literate, he was well read. And here's that, here are those pointed, multiple pointed archways. And again, they talk about this in the video and why I talk about it from time to time. Stone is heavy. Stone has a lot of great characteristics, desirable characteristics, why you would want to build buildings with this stuff. It's very sturdy. It stands up to rain. It stands up to wind. It's non-flammable. Can't burn stone per se, but you can burn some limestone. I digress. And so it has a lot of properties that make this choice for building your buildings, but the problem is it's so heavy and you can't go up that high. So all of this stuff we've been talking about post and lintel, gave them a way to distribute weight, the archways, and in this way, the pointed vault, which is kind of an archway, but as it showed in the video, it pushes the weight down. And we talk about buttresses as well. And so anyway, this is how you deal with building stone. And here's that east end, the ambulatory, goes around here, and these are the radiating chapels. Sujet design. And so anyway, this becomes the kind of the model. And so we built after the 1194 fire. And so what was there before, well, still has the same shape. It's still something of a crucifix. And we see the ambulatory and the chapels. And here's what it looks like on the outside. Chartres, in terms of how it's built, becomes even higher. Their technology is growing. We saw this in Saint Denis, 1140, 1194. 50 years. They can go higher. And they have an interesting idea about symmetry. That one side looks like the other. And you see the towers. You also see the cross shape. That is Gothic cathedrals. And you see the ornamentation has exploded. And you see over here, I'll get a little zoom in on these. These things here, they are flying buttresses. Sometimes, as the early buttresses were, they would incorporate those into a wall. In this case, they're outside the building. That's why they call them flying buttresses. There's nothing connected to them. They're not hidden. They're right out there in space. But all of this stuff contributes to the ability to go up. And so here's Chartres Cathedral from the front. You can see, I want to show you this too. There's a little chart that's in the book. There it is. Nave elevations of 4 Gothic cathedrals at the same scale. And so height of nave at Lyon, 80 feet. Paris, height of nave, Paris because it's Notre Dame, Paris. 115, 120, 144 feet high. And so you can see that was the ambition, that was the purpose, to move higher. And when you're inside these, a more majestic, a more feeling, not so much as they talked about with Romanesque, where everything was heavy and it seemed like it was real solid, light, airy, and give you a sense of space all the way up into the heavens. And so there's Lyon. Again, these are all different in their own ways. And we see, again, different kinds of ornamentation. The Chartres becomes like, after Denis, Chartres, Notre Dame. And so I want to talk a little bit more about Chartres, but we're running out of time. So, any questions? We'll talk about Chartres, and we're going to talk about this too, Notre Dame, which burned down, caught on fire. Well, how could that happen? It's made out of stone. Well, I'll tell you. So I'll see you Wednesday.